Welcome to the podcast, Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Today's episode is the first of a two-part series on the crusading order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Knights Templar or just simply as the Templars. My co-host for these episodes is a veteran of this podcast, Dr. Steve Tibble, whom you might remember from our episode about Crusaders and settlers in the Holy Land. Welcome back to Tis But a Scratch, Steve.
Thank you, Richard. It's lovely to be here with you again. It's very kind of you to invite me.
Steve Tibble is a graduate of Cambridge and London universities and has an honorary position at Royal Holloway College, University of London. He is one of the foremost historians of the Crusades, in particular of crusading warfare. Steve is the author of 6 books, 5 of which he has published with the Yale University Press since 2018. Now, that may not be astounding for a Stephen King or a Michael Connelly, but it's pretty amazing for a serious historian. How did you do that?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it says something about Yale, doesn't it? I mean, I do love them. We're very lucky that we've got such great publishers, and they do beautiful books. They're really professional. They're a dream to work with. So I think that makes it easier. I mean, there is a technical side to writing, liking the team that you're working with, being able to work with them properly and, be confident about the outcome. But I think I had a very long career break.
I noticed that. Your first book, Monarchy and Lordships in the Latin Kingdoms, not published with Yale, but published by Oxford University Press, was back in 1989, the year after I published my first book. Now, I thought I had a hiatus of 10 years, but you have had a hiatus of 19 years. And how did that happen?
Yeah, well, a huge amount, really. I mean, I basically, dear Mrs. Thatcher was doing her thing, restructuring British industry when I finished my PhD. And I started my PhD as a mature student anyway. So my first book, published in 89, it was pretty much written in 86. So it's sort of, my word, yeah. So it's 40 years ago that came out.
The same for my book. I'm always depressed by that.
So girls got to eat, and I had a family and everything. So I ended up in advertising and business strategy, corporate branding strategy for a very long time. So I think I came back to the Crusades, and I still kept in touch with the guys. And Jonathan Riley-Smith was my old supervisor at Cambridge, and he was a constant presence and a dear friend throughout. But it did mean I had this kind of huge well of what passes for creativity with me. Anyway, there was this desire to write that I hadn't really been able to, put into action while I had a very busy job and children and mortgages to pay and things like that. So so I've come at it with a huge appetite, and I love every minute, and I count myself blessed that I'm able to do it, and with such a lovely publisher as well.
So let me just list the books for our audience. All of these are Yale University Press: The Crusader Armies, 2018, The Crusader Strategy, 2020, Templars, The Knights Who Made Britain, which we'll touch on probably in this and the next episode, Crusader Criminals, The Knights Who Went Rogue in the Holy Land, which we talked about in our episode together, and most recently, the book we'll talk about now, Assassins and Templars, A Battle in Myth and Blood. Now, I've talked about the Shiite sect known as the Assassins in an earlier episode of this podcast, the episode on the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat, King-elect of Jerusalem, by honest-to-God assassins. So today, I'm going to draw upon Steve's expertise to tell us about the most notorious, and yes, I'm using that word correctly, notorious rather than simply famous, the most notorious crusading order, the Order of the Templars. As I said, this is a two-part series. In the first episode, we're going to look at the founding of the Templar Order, its purpose, and its military and financial activities. In the second episode, we'll discuss what has made the Templars famous, what has made them notorious, their trial for heresy and suppression, and their subsequent transformation into a myth much beloved by conspiracy theorists. As Italian medievalist, semiotician, novelist, and cultural critic Umberto Eco observed in his novel Foucault's Pendulum, you can always identify a lunatic conspiracy theorist, quote, by the fact that sooner or later he brings up the Templars. Okay.
So true, so true. What a great quote. And I loved your episode on Conrad of Montferrat, and I totally agree with your
So who do you think
conclusions.
really hired the assassins then? My wife really
I-
believes it was Richard who did it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't go on holiday with Richard. I doubt he'd invite me, but I don't hate him. But I doesn't seem like his style to me. And it was actually an inconvenience for him, really. He wanted to go home pretty much at
Yeah.
that point. To be honest, I don't know. And people at the time didn't know. Even when you look at the Muslim sources on Saladin's side, the guys are coming up with different possibilities. I think it might have been Saladin. I mean, it might have been, The other thing about the assassins is they were always short of cash, and they were looking for ways to insert themselves into, the political world of the time, because they were a tiny group, and they did incredibly well, using the word well in the most advised sense. But they were looking to insert themselves into it. I think it's a hit that they wanted, that they were happy to do themselves, and I think you referred to it. There is some evidence that there was a kind of commercial dispute with
Yes.
Conrad as well. Never underestimate the boring small details. That's it, it's like the mafia. You get the mafia on tax dodging. It's that kind of stuff that will trip you up. So I think the short answer is I think the assassins did it. The assassins wanted to do it. Who actually paid them the money to do it?
I tend to believe that it was probably done because that's what the old man on the mountain wanted to do, and he
Yeah.
had it done. But why pair the Assassins, which is a Shiite sect, with the Templars, which is a Christian military order? That is an order of fighting monks, which may sound like an oxymoron, but really isn't, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah. No, thank you, Richard. Well, it really comes back to your first point. I did have this hiatus in my career, and a lot of that was spent in looking at branding and strategy. It's like, and I could sense with both of these two groups that here you have people who are intuitive. They wouldn't have articulated it like this, and they wouldn't have had the vocabulary. But these were people who were intuitively fabulous at corporate branding. They were tiny groups that really punched above their weight, and to use your word, notorious. Both of
Yes.
them in their own spheres became hugely notorious. We're still talking about them. The internet is still full of them. Movies are still made about them.
Not only movies, but video games.
Oh, yeah.
Assassin's Creed beat you to the pairing of the Assassins and the Templars and presents them as in a centuries-long struggle between these two secret societies. But we'll talk about that in the movies in our second episode. What it does prove is your point about branding, even though the branding in this case is hardly positive.
For tiny groups of guys, you have to say it's one of the huge branding successes of world history, really.
And you're absolutely right about the success of the branding, though I'm sure that neither group would want to have been remembered the way that they are in this popular imagination.
Absolutely. But yeah, and I think it's more fundamental than that as well. I mean, so there is, you can it kind of takes one to know one, so I could see a branding professional there, somebody who is innately very good at it. The other thing, though, I think is the way in which they used branding, and this created a cult of the fear of death, and were able to exploit that. So with the Templar, they were right in your face. They were death in your face, and they perfected the art of charging at the opposite general, nearly managed to kill Saladin, that kind of thing. You knew you were in trouble when the Templars had you in their sights. And it was the same with the Assassins, except they were the kind of opposite. They were always at your back rather than at your front. You just knew that once they latched onto you, you had a serious problem. And so both of them I felt had a huge amount in common. And the weird thing is, of course, that they did actually bounce off each other in real life as well. They hated each other's guts because they were probably too similar in ways that they'd have never wanted to admit.
And they both got really unfairly treated by not so much historians, but by the popular ideas of them. We don't remember the
Yeah.
Assassins as a Shiite sect. We remember the Assassins from what the name itself has become, as a group who were just simply murdering other people for pay. And that's partly what they were, but it's not what that's not what they were fundamentally. And in the case of the Templars, what we're talking about is a military order. So what is or what was a military order? Basically, it was warrior monks. A military order was a monastic community, a monastic order in which the brothers served God not only through prayer, but by bearing arms in defense of the church, of fellow Christians, in defense of the faith. Military orders were a byproduct of crusading, and the Knights Templar, or more formally, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, was the first of these orders. It was the template for multiple military orders that were to follow it. But the very notion of warrior monks raises a theological issue. It sounds a lot like an oxymoron. Now, Christianity is at its very heart it's going to sound weird to say because of Christian nationalism, which is raging in this country at least. But Christianity's in its foundation and its very heart is a pacifist religion. It renounces violence. And yet, what we have are military orders.
That's a very good point, Richard. And it's one that, it's always resonated. I mean, it was raised at the time. And because Christianity is fundamentally pacifistic, even at the time, there was a very heated debate about whether it was legitimate to have military orders, because it does sound kind of Orwellian. And, I often find this when I'm doing talks and people, if, say somebody in the audience is a Quaker, and they'll come up and, and start having this debate. And it's still a live debate. The big issue, I think, is that Christianity obviously is a religion that looks to the afterlife and redemption, love, and Christ as the Prince of Love and Prince of Peace. And again, you see another irony there. But it also has to function in the material world. So there is, right from the beginning of Christianity, there was certainly organized Christianity at the end days of the Roman Empire. There were, as Europe became Christian, this tension was already there. So you find St. Augustine has already, and this is a very early sort of time, is already talking about the justification of violence in defense of the poor, the vulnerable. It's very much the use and acceptance of defensive violence. And certainly from a Crusades perspective, they would have seen, the Holy Land and the Christian communities of the Holy Land, who were still the majority. Obviously, when the original Muslim invasions of the 7th century took place, the whole of that, the region of the Crusades were actually Christian. Some of the vast majority of the population were Christian, and they were obviously being subjugated by Muslims. And then there were another wave of Muslim invasions in the 11th century, and the trigger for the First Crusade was defensive. They would have seen it as, anyway. It's to defend the local Christian communities who were still the majority population in the 11th and 12th centuries. So it sounds more ironic than it actually is. So it's in the sense that, if you're walking down the street and somebody attacks you, are you able to defend yourself? If somebody attacks your family, are you able to defend yourself against them? And in Christian terms, you are able to. You're not you have to use commensurate force. You're not supposed to be aggressive. And certainly in the Crusades, I mean, very little action in the Crusades, if any, really, took place in lands that hadn't already been Christian. And there was no sort of forced conversion. That was very much not part of what the military orders were about at all, though there are some sort of, some mythology about that. It's completely untrue. So although it does sound kind of Orwellian, it does have a basis in practicality. If, say, for instance, Second World War, Hitler's attacking you, what do? Do you say, come on in, let's all be Nazis, or do you fight and defend yourself? And I think the Crusades and the military orders would have seen themselves as basically taking a defensive stance.
Yes, absolutely. Christian ideas about warfare and violence in the year 1100 had evolved greatly from what they had been during the first centuries of Christianity. We tend to think of the Crusades as holy wars, and they're holy wars, but in Christian ideology, what we're talking about is Christian just war theory. Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095 pitched the First Crusade as a just war to recover God's own land, Jerusalem, and to protect oppressed Christians. Putting aside that oppression was overblown and that Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands now for 4.5 centuries, the First Crusade would have been viewed by the clergy as a just war. What made crusading revolutionary was not that it was holy war, but was the offer of spiritual indulgences for those who took the cross. Warfare not only could be waged by Christians without endangering their souls, but now a particular type of war could actually earn them the kingdom of heaven. But to push back just a little, what would have made the Templars truly revolutionary was that they were a religious order that fought. And that was a complete reversal of the traditional role of the Christian clergy in warfare. Before this, to be a miles Christi, a soldier of Christ, meant to be a spiritual warrior. The ideal miles Christi was St. Martin of Tours, a mid-4th century Roman soldier who left the army on the eve of battle after experiencing a crisis of conscience that led him to believe that as a Christian soldier he could not shed blood. Martin became a hermit and then Bishop of Tours, and was the model for medieval knights like St. Bernard of Clairvaux who became monks. To top it off, early church councils specifically prohibited clerics and monks from bearing arms or for shedding blood. Clergy accompanied armies on campaigns, but their function was to administer sacraments and to pray for victory, not to fight. But that all changed with the Templars.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my previous episode with Steve Murillo, and I do love how these episodes seem to build on each other, Steve and I discussed that many knights and samurai retired to monasteries at the end of their lives because in both Christianity and Buddhism, killing is sinful and must be expiated. The spiritual anxiety of knights about their profession of arms helps explain the popularity of both crusading and the special attraction that the Templars held for knights. One solution to the problem was to conceive of knighthood as a Christian order, and that emerged around the year 1100. Gets to become a Christian order, one of the three orders: those who fight for us, those who pray for us, those who feed us, those who work for us.
Yeah, all good things, yes.
Yeah. So those who fight, if it's just simply those who fight, that's a bad thing. If it's those who fight for us, that becomes a good thing. And the attraction of the Crusades to the Knights was it gave them a justification for their livelihood, for their self-identity as a military elite. If they're just fighting amongst themselves over land, over even honor, they are basically committing sins. And the only way you're going to get into heaven then is if you renounce the order and you go into a monastery at the end of your life and you get a lot of people to pray for you.
Exactly.
The individual who probably think best expressed this was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who becomes the patron saint of the Templars and one of their founding fathers. In the year 1146, Bernard of Clairvaux arguably then the most influential churchman in Christendom, was asked by Pope Eugene III to recruit for the Second Crusade. This was a savvy choice. Bernard was not only from a noble family, but he had been raised as a knight. He entered the new austere Cistercian monastic order not as a child oblate or an old man, but in his early 20s. He understood the values of knighthood, and he knew how to appeal both to the knight's spiritual anxiety and to their self-image as warriors. In this letter, he contrasts secular warfare in Europe with crusade. The former, he says, arises from the spirit of hatred and leads to damnation. Quote, how dire of madness goads those wretched men when kinsmen strike each other's bodies with the sword, perchance causing the soul also to perish. But he does not escape who triumphs. The sword shall go through his own soul as well when he thinks to have slain only his enemy. To enter such combat is madness, not valor. It is not to be ascribed to bravery, but rather to foolishness. And now comes the sales pitch for taking the cross. But now, O brave knight, now, O warlike warrior, here is a battle you may fight without danger, where it is glory to conquer and gain to die. Bernard presented crusading as an act of love for fellow Christians, not an act of hatred. This letter was, as I said, a recruitment pitch for crusaders. But a decade earlier, on behalf of Hugh de Pau, the founder of the order, Bernard wrote a treatise called The New Knighthood to recruit knights to join the Templars. Basically, a treatise on why we all should become Templars if we're knights. He writes about the worldly knighthood. What then is the end or fruit of this worldly night, or rather knavery, as I should call it? What if not the mortal sin of the victor and the eternal death of the vanquished? Well, then, let me borrow a word from the apostle and exhort him who plows to plow in hope, and him who threshes to do so in some fruit. What then, O knights, in the monstrous error, and what this unbearable urge which bids you fight with pomp and labor, and all to no purpose except death and sin? You cover your horses with silk and plume your armor with I know not what sort of rags. You paint your shields and your saddles. You adorn your bits and spurs with gold and silver. And he goes on and on about this. And it's all really sinful. And it's written by someone who may be, he was going to be a monk who was writing this as an abbot, but himself had been brought up to be a knight.
Yeah.
It's the spiritual anxiety of the knighthood that makes
Yes.
the Templars and the Crusades so attractive.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the founding of this particular order. And let me start by quoting an Anglo-Saxon, an Anglo-Saxon merchant. There was an Englishman by the name of Ceolwulf. Ceolwulf from Worcester went on pilgrimage in the year 1102. So this is after the First Crusade. And this is after the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And he wrote what essentially is a guidebook for future pilgrims upon his return. Now, among the things that he was emphasizing is it's really dangerous to go on pilgrimage. It's dangerous to go by sea. You get attacked by Saracen pirates all the time. But the most dangerous part of it is the hills right outside of Jerusalem, the Judean hills. This is what he wrote. We traveled from Joppa to the city of Jerusalem 2 days' journey by a mountainous route, which is very difficult and dangerous, as the Saracens are always seeking to ambush the Christians. They lie concealed in the caverns of the mountains and the caves of the rocks on the lookout night and day for anyone they can easily attack, either pilgrims traveling in small bands or exhausted stragglers separated from their companions. Seawolf added that along the way he saw many corpses of pilgrims abandoned on or near the road. And the fact that they're not buried is striking. And the reason they're not buried is if you stop to bury them, you're going to join them. And someone's going to have to bury you. It's a dangerous trip, and it may have been actually much more dangerous now than when the Muslims actually controlled Jerusalem and would have taken tolls rather than just ambushed pilgrims. So that gives us a purpose, right? So why
Yeah,
don't you tell the story
absolutely.
about how this order gets founded?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're 100% right. It probably did get more dangerous. I mean, it had been very dangerous before because of criminality. And, we know from the experience of German pilgrims in the 1060s, they could be massive massacres. So I think everywhere in the Middle East, medieval Middle East, is not a safe place. And it's not actually just about religion, it's about criminality in many cases. But the Templars are really founded, they kind of found themselves. They're kind of an informal grouping, really. I think they're a bunch of kind of enthusiasts. And I think, apropos your point earlier, Richard, about what motivates a knight to involve themselves in the Crusades, is really the explanation from a personal level on why people were proud to join the Templars and why the Templars came out of a group of enthusiasts. I think we can look at motivation from quite a cynical perspective and say it was used to justify their position, as if that was some kind of cynical way forward. But and in fact, I think they were just very pious. It's very hard for us in a much more secular world, however often you go to mass or synagogue or mosque, we're not as religious as they were, but we don't take it that literally. So it did. You're absolutely right. It did have a very natural fit with the psyche of Europe's elite warriors, and it provided a profound legitimization of their calling. Really, I mean, they didn't always live up to it, of course, because humans, we're all just a bunch of monkeys, so it's, but in theory, it did actually do that. So it seems as though the Templars started from a group of guys, maybe left over from the First Crusade, maybe from the period where Dear Saywolf is having his horrid journey. And in fact, ironically, the most dangerous part of his trip, which was hideously dangerous, as you pointed out, didn't come from pirates or bandits on the road. It came from just sailing in the Mediterranean. I think most of his friends were killed before they even got off the boat because there was a big storm in I think the Jaffa where they landed. Yeah. So you find this tiny group of guys. We've got only the word of William of Tyre for this, really, and Walter Map to a lesser extent. I mean, these are very much kind of sort of Hollywood-style backstories. You wouldn't necessarily stake your house on any of these. And William of Tyre ended up becoming very anti-Templar. So you have to be careful how you read, his thoughts on this. But it does seem that they were a tiny group of guys, less than a dozen men. They were very pious, but they weren't part of a religious order. They were dressed in secondhand clothes. They accepted, clothing and I imagine food to keep them safe. And it does seem there's some evidence that they were clustered around the Holy Sepulchre and that they might have been used as kind of bouncers. They were the kind of security team, because one of the marvelous things from the Crusaders' perspective was that they'd uncovered wonderful relics and religious treasures. And the Holy Sepulchre was, obviously a big treasure in itself, but then there's a treasure room within it. So there were indications that they started off as kind of like, nightclub bouncers, but for the main church of Christianity. And then, as you quite rightly say, one of the main justifications for their founding in 1118, 1119, depending on whether William gets his dates right or not, is that they become the kind of traffic cops of the Crusades. That tiny piece of road. I mean, I think you can walk it certainly in 2 days. Depending on how fit you are. It's not. I've been up it a couple of times. It's not a place to go ambling, but it's not the biggest length of road. But you see by the end of the Crusades, the castles along the road. You're very rarely out of sight of a castle. It's so intensely policed because it's so intensely dangerous. And at that point, the Crusades, the latter kingdom of Jerusalem, only had that one very significant port. So that single road was the lifeline from Jerusalem back to Europe. So it was hideously important. But bizarrely, because even though the Templars are so large in our minds and image now, and we assume they had grand armies, in reality, they were probably just, at the beginning, they were just a handful of guys doing quite humble things like, traffic patrols.
And William of Tyre says that there were only 9 of them to begin with. And even after a few years, it was still only 9 of these guys. They're, they're, they get that grand title that they're the Knights of the Temple of Solomon, which is kind of weird because you think, what do they mean by the Temple of Solomon? What they mean is Yalakska Mosque when they're talking about that, because it's been misidentified as the Temple of Solomon. Now, what makes them really successful, because they seem to be self-founded, they take vows of poverty and chastity, which, and I'm not going to be at all ironic about this. This is true piety on their part. And we're talking about individuals who are giving up a lot. The founder of the order, the so-called, is Yu of Pan, and Yu of Pan is a knight who's a lord of a small lordship in Champagne, but is still a lord at home, and he's married. He's renouncing his family, he's renouncing his lordship, and he's embracing poverty and chastity along with the others who are with him. And these are people who are rebranding themselves, re-identifying themselves. They're embracing religion. So I'm not at all being cynical about these guys. I accept their piety. I accept that they were authentic in their piety. But they also want not simply to be recognized by the King of Jerusalem, they want papal approval. And so they go to Rome to get papal approval. And the man who really makes them isn't so much the Pope, Pope Honorius. The man who makes them is Bernard of Clairvaux, because they stir something in Bernard. So why don't you take over for that and tell us a little bit about what Bernard of Clairvaux sees in them and how they become a Christian order?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the key thing, I guess, is that we're looking at it with hindsight. So we know that dear Bernard actually, succeeded, and the guys succeeded, Hugh succeeded.
Yeah.
But they weren't successful. I mean, to go from a group of 9 impoverished men to a group of 9 impoverished men in the course of a decade is like, you wouldn't get anybody to give you financial backing on that base. That's a business that's not going anywhere. But we're looking at it from the point of view of thinking of them as being on a trajectory, that they were going to grow from this small acorn into this large oak tree that became the Templars. But in reality, there's no reason to think in the early days that anybody gave them a second thought, really, the very early days. Fulcher of Chartres was writing about that time. He lived around the corner for large parts of that time. He probably knew the guys, but he didn't bother mentioning them because, they're whatever, the bouncers at the Holy Sepulchre, they weren't worthy of even mention, let alone, bigging them up. And we do know that there were other orders, confraternities sprang up in Antioch and Edessa. You find there are these little groups of very pious knights that, one of them ends up getting, I think it's St. Peter, the confraternity of St. Peter ends up getting wiped out at the Battle of the Field of Blood. You can tell it's going to be a bad ending just when you get the name of the battle, can't you? So I think there is an element of luck in all this. We only see the ones that loom large are the survivors. We don't know about the 9 groups of pious knights that sort of fell by the wayside. We just know the ones that survived. But for whatever reason, I suspect it was personalities. There was Godfrey of Saint-Omer and Hugh, as you quite rightly say, were the 2 sort of founder figures. And I think dear Bernard must have seen something in them, particularly in Hugh, because Hugh ended up leading a mission to Europe, and he only took 5 guys with him. And you think, oh, that's not much, but actually, that was most of the Templars.
Yes.
So literally, you could have sat them around the table for breakfast. That's how insignificant it was. And I think that dear Bernard must have seen something. There must have been some resonance between him and Hugh. Hugh, if you just look at his achievements, Hugh was certainly a very charismatic, person, probably a very great orator, because in 1127 there was this mission to go back to Europe, and 1128, 29, he basically just went on the road, and he must have been pretty scruffy. He didn't have a great story to tell. He's saying, "Come and join up, almost certain death. My organization is still so pitifully small, and I haven't managed to grow it over the last decade." On one level, it's a really hard sell, but he managed it, and he electrified the elite of Europe, and to the point where they were queuing to give land, money, to volunteer, and so on. And he together with Bernard gave the kind of the structure. He gave the kind of intellectual support to it. And I suspect Hugh and Godfrey and their 7 other chums were probably quite rough around the edges. Secondhand clothes, scraps of food, and so on. These are not sophisticated, smooth talking investor relations guys. But he managed to do this road trip that turned this tiny group of nobodies into what was soon to become an international order. And then once that got underway, people realized what a great idea it was. And I guess we should talk about it. And and the combination of Hugh and Bernard, we obviously, it was sad. It would be lovely to meet them and talk about that, talk to them face to face. But there was clearly some magic there, where you've got Bernard as the kind of intellectual powerhouse, and you've got Hugh as like charisma on a stick. And so he can talk the language that the military elite understand. And it's like, so suddenly they want to be like Hugh. They want to put their military skills to the ultimate test of spiritual rewards.
And it's really interesting that one of the things that Bernard gives them is the primitive rule. And I just reread the primitive rule, and it's fascinating because it is that combination. It is a rule which is modeled on the Cistercian rule. Bernard is, again, one of the great founders of the Cistercian movement. And on one hand, it is religious. It's a rule which tells about what they can eat, how they can dress, the prayers, and all of the things that you expect from a monastic rule. But on the other hand, it also talks about armor. It talks about horses. It talks about the knights joining it, and how, if you're married, what you need to do to join it, and all of the other things. It's that hybrid that is creating something new in Christianity, and is in itself interesting for that reason. And it becomes a model for the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and the other military orders that are going to rise up because of the attraction that this ideal of Christian militarism has. The Christianity of the Templars, as conceived by Bernard, is certainly muscular. Sections of his treatise, The New Knighthood, read like a celebration of violence, not merely a justification, but a celebration of violence in which killing is glorious and death is martyrdom. Quote, "The Knight of Christ may strike with confidence and die yet more confidently, for he serves Christ when he strikes and serves himself when he falls. Neither does he bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of the good." And that paraphrases Romans 13. If he kills an evildoer, he is not a man-killer, but, if I may so put it, a killer of evil. He is evidently the avenger of Christ towards the evildoers, and he is rightly considered defender of Christians. Should he be killed himself, we know that he has not perished, but has come safely into port. When he inflicts death, it is to Christ's profit, and when he suffers death, it is for his own gain. The Christian glories in the death of the pagan because Christ is glorified, while the death of the Christian gives occasion for the king to show his generosity in the rewarding of his knight. In the one case, the just shall rejoice when he sees justice done, and in the other, man shall say, truly, there is a reward for the just. Truly, it is God who judges the earth. And no, that isn't a Pentagon briefing by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. Okay, I know that's a bit snarky, But the guy does have a Crusader cross tattoo on his chest and the words Deus Vult, God wills it, the Crusader motto tattooed on his bicep. And he proudly shows them off on his Instagram page. Hegseth is certainly in touch with the Crusader spirit. But lest anyone think that Bernard is advocating wanton killing of all non-Christians, he adds, quote, I do not mean to say that the pagans ought to be slaughtered when there is any other way to prevent them from harassing and persecuting the faithful, but only that it now seems better to destroy them than that the rod of sinners be lifted over the lot of the just, and the righteous perhaps put forth their hands unto iniquity. Thus Bernard steers a mid-course between justifying and moderating Christian violence. The Templars, as soldiers of Christ, bear arms in defense of Christianity and in defense of their fellow Christians, and in doing so are motivated by love of God and neighbor rather than hatred, even hatred of pagans.
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
defensive.
Very much so. You're absolutely right. But equally, I think you really put your finger on it there. There is this militaristic aspect at the inception of the Templars. And I'm currently writing a book, the history of it's called The Knights of Malta. So the history of the Hospitallers, yes, with Rory McClellan, again for Yale, because I love them. And it's really striking that their initial rule, if you didn't know they were a military order, you'd be hard put to guess. I mean, it's not a militaristic document at all. It is much more about, it's a spiritual side rather than that. But the Templars, I think, were always different. They were always, if there's a spectrum with, military on one side and spiritual on the other, they were the military order that was most militaristic, whereas people like the Hospitallers had other things to do. They were looking after the poor. They were helping pilgrims. They were, like nowadays, running eye surgery and so on. So even though they were militarized, no one was as wedded to the idea as the Templars. And I suspect that's one reason why we're still so obsessed with them in the 21st century, because they have this kind of, like the Assassins, they're spiritually motivated, but they find expression for that through supreme elite violence, which makes for great films and great conspiracy theories and things like that.
And the subsequent rule of the Templars, when it becomes fully developed, it becomes like a manual of warfare for medieval warfare. It tells you how to do a cavalry charge. It's a wonderful resource for military historians of the period.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
So we have now the foundation of this order. We have this, and they start off with this limited military role, as you say, bouncers, traffic cops. How does it develop? How does the military role change?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And it's one of those things, in history, it's often very difficult to put your finger on it. But actually, I personally think there is a point. There's one point on the Second Crusade where they have a big role. It's basically a French contingent, and they are very heavily embedded in it. They're small in number, but they're the most professional by far element in the army. That's one of the really big things that they bring to Europe, is they bring an understanding of what warfare in the East is like. Yes. And the knights look alike, but warfare is so different. And the whole Darwinistic thing of learning by action means that a Crusader army could be half destroyed before their guys even learn how to fight properly. And on the Second Crusade, you see this playing out. So the French army struggles around, walks halfway across Europe, and then it gets really cut up badly by the Turks. And it's so bad that the whole army effectively, the French king Louis says to the Templars, "Okay, guys, all my people are clearly rubbish. I need you to take over." And the army are forced to take, as individuals, they take an oath to the Templars. It sounds pretty much as though they become temporary Templar associates, so almost like brother sergeants. And the Templars are able to create a much more cohesive force. So I think they've already clearly they didn't just learn that on the spot. So they've been fighting out in the East and doing, running castles and all the kind of more complex military maneuvers that you have to have when you're facing Turkic light cavalry. But to me, that is the moment where the expertise of the Templars in the East meets the military might of the West and is able to refine it. And to me, that's a seminal moment. When they become the big military player, really, not necessarily in terms of numbers, but they are just the go-to people, the elite force.
Numbers are really interesting when it comes to the Templars. As you pointed out, the Templars became an extremely successful monastic order in terms of attracting recruits and attracting donations, properties, gifts. They were especially attractive to the class of knights for the reasons that we talked about. At the time of the dissolution of the Templars in the early 14th century, and numbers are really rough here, there were perhaps 15,000 members of the order. That is 15,000 people who were associated with the order. But this is a bit misleading, as only about 10% were full knight brothers. More served as sergeants, that is, lightly armored mounted soldiers, but most were engaged in non-military activities. Compared with the Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and non-military monastic orders, the Templars were pretty much decentralized. The master of the order was headquartered in Jerusalem, at least until that city fell to Saladin in 1187, and the master was the unquestioned commander-in-chief when the Templars engaged in combat. The order was also divided into about a dozen provinces, but for the most part, the commanders of the 1,000 or so Templar houses, or as they were known, preceptories, like Benedictine abbots, acted autonomously. Perhaps most surprising, the number of full knight brothers in the Levant at any one time rarely exceeded 300. They were supplemented by perhaps 1,000 or so ancillary troops, which included not only sergeant brothers, but native Turcoples and even mercenaries. The great majority of Templars resided in Europe, stationed in preceptories, or tending to the 10,000 or so farms and other properties belonging to the order. This may sound like an odd distribution of personnel, given the primary mission of the order to defend the Holy Land and protect pilgrims, but it shouldn't surprise military historians. All armies, modern as well as pre-modern, have a high tail-to-tooth ratio. That is, the number of support personnel required to support combatants, and the Templars were no exception. And yet, despite their modest numbers, they were really important militarily. But despite their very modest numbers, they were really important militarily in virtually every crusade, every crusading campaign, and that's because, as you explained, they were the resident experts in this type of warfare, as well as being the best trained and well disciplined troops, the elite core of any crusading army.
No, you're absolutely right, Richard. And that sort of comes back to the why I paired them up with the assassins. It's the same thing. We get tiny numbers of young men who are expert at what they do and committed to their cause, and they can have an effect way beyond their numbers. And the Templars are the archetype of that, really, in the medieval world. My wife's a medieval art historian, and we're just finishing a manuscript on, it's another book, on part of which is founded on what does the Templar army actually look like. It's about the role of non-Catholics in the defense of the Holy Land, effectively. It's got his working title is Arabian Nights, because I want to give a voice to the native communities, really. And if you look at the Templar armies, say if you look at Kingdom of Heaven, which I love, it's beautiful.
Did you really like that movie? I hate that film. I hate it.
I love it because it's a film. Oh. It's not a lecture. If it was a lecture series, I wouldn't like it. But as a film which shows me, visually, it's very powerful. But so where you see a charge, it's always just a thin layer of knights. And as you say, the rule of the temple really makes it clear that even with a purely cavalry charge, the knights are a thin layer, but they are just tip of the spear. There's the sergeants behind them, there's the Turcopoles, there's the cooks riding behind on donkeys in the fourth rank if necessary, all of that stuff. And if you look at Templar garrisons like at Safad, where we have some significant details, it's the Templars are significantly less than 10% of the troops, maybe 5%. So even in the Templar army, and again at Safad, we know because when they surrendered, there was this big hoo-ha because the local Orthodox Christians were kind of separated in terms of their motivation from the local Catholics who were the Templars. So most of a Templar army would actually have consisted of local Arabs, Armenians, Syrians, who were Christian, but from different Orthodox sects. And it's particularly ironic, given that if you look at the internet, you'd think that the Templars were these kind of Aryan nation, kind of cage fighters,
yes,
who are racist in some way. And there's not a scrap of evidence for that. I mean, the guys, a Templar army, the commands being banded around would be in Arabic, probably, or or Armenian. They were there to help the local Arab and Armenian communities. They weren't there as some kind of racist kind of overlords,
which actually caused some criticism back in Europe when you had crusaders who newly arrived in the Holy Land, and they're expecting that the Templars, who they've known from back home, are going to be at the very forefront of all of this. And instead, the guys they meet are dressed like the locals. They are able to speak Arabic. My favorite story is the story that Usama ibn Bankit, who spent his entire life fighting in, most of the 12th century, he's just fighting against Christians. And he's one of the few actually Arab rather than Turkish warriors. Yes. And he goes to Jerusalem and he wants to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And they have actually a nice little room over there for Muslims to go pray. And he encounters a crusader right off the boat. And the crusader is really disturbed, not that he's praying, but he's praying in the wrong direction. He's not praying towards the east. He's praying towards the south, towards Mecca. And he tries to grab him to change his position. And Usama is rescued by a couple of Templars who he says are people he knows. They're sort of his friends. And they rescue him and they apologize to him. Now, this is a wonderful story that Usama tells, but it also brings up the criticism that the Templars went native.
Yeah, and actually, you're absolutely right. And even when they were being suppressed, there were accusations that they'd even gone further, that they'd betrayed Christendom and they were fighting for the enemy, which is weird. I mean, I don't think a single one of those charges was true.
And we'll get to talk about that in the next episode.
But I think what you've and Usama quite rightly spotted was the kind of naivety. It says more about the people coming in from the West than it does about the people in the East. There's a basic naivety. They don't really know what they're going to face. The Templars are the experts, and they're the experts on the ground. The reason they're good at warfare out there is because they know how different warfare is. And the reason, obviously, warfare is almost, particularly if you're a Frank, warfare is almost a last resort in many occasions because you're so heavily outnumbered. And particularly in the 13th century, a lot of the activity was actually trying to avoid violence, get long truces, get decent diplomatic actions, play one Muslim player off against another.
And there is really good reason for that. There was never all that large a number of Knights Templar at any one time in the Holy Land, and the loss of one of them required a replacement to come from Europe. What made this even more problematic was when the Templars actually did engage in the few general battles that took place, their aggressive approach to warfare sometimes proved disastrous. Just to give a few statistics. In the Battle of Harim of 1164, the Templars lost 60 dead out of a contingent of 67. On May 1st, in 1187, in the Battle of the Springs of Cresson, the Templars lost 87 of 90 full knight brothers, in addition to a few hundred mounted sergeants. Virtually all the remaining Templar knights in the Levant were wiped out 2 months later in the Battle of Hattin. About 70 Knights Templar fell in the battle itself. 2 days later, Saladin ordered the execution of a combined 230 Templars and Hospitallers who had surrendered because he respected their military ability too much to allow them to be ransomed and to fight again. The Battle of La Forbie in 1244 was an even greater disaster for the Templars. Of the 300 full knight brothers who fought at La Forbie, only 33 survived. As I've said before in a number of different episodes, the standard military doctrine of the High Middle Ages revolved around raiding and sieges. Battles were avoided because they were chancy and dangerous, especially when manpower was not an easily renewable source, as was the case with the Templars. It is little wonder that the Templars preferred diplomacy to combat. And Steve, as you point out in your book, they were really good at diplomacy.
And the Templars, all kudos to them, were the experts at that as well. You find, all the way through the Crusades, often the people of choice. Ironically, and again, they're not the fanatical racist nutcases. They're the ones that the local Muslim leaders are most comfortable dealing with, because they know how things work. They know that they are, most of their men are, the ones who aren't brothers are actually locals like them, more local than all the Turkic overlords, for instance. So yeah, it's another one of those ironies. It's a fundamental issue as well, which isn't racist. It actually comes down to culture. The Pulani, which were what the local Franks were called, I think were actually ethnically different. Because it's like Vikings. They don't bring loads of wives in the boats with them. They have special hugs with the ladies that they meet. And you find in the Crusades the guys there are all where we have documentation about settlement. They're all getting married to local women, mostly local Christians, some converts, very, very quickly. So within, and we're talking about people who are having children very quickly. So generations are quite short. So, the kings of Jerusalem, the royal families were all of mixed ethnicity. Most of the Pulani were actually ethnically different to the Westerners who were kind of spooked by them. But the interesting thing is you're never really aware of that, because nobody's terribly racist, because they're not interested in race, they're interested in religion. So what really shocks the Westerners is the fact that everybody's comfortable dealing with the local Muslims, because wow, they're a different religion. So how's that even possible? So it's quite difficult to put yourself back in their minds, because now there's an obsession with race and ethnicity, but they didn't share that. And equally, they had an obsession with religion that we don't no longer share. So it's you have to be really careful how you look at the primary sources. It's they're not quite what you think.
I completely agree. And it raises an important point that we ought not to be imposing our concerns, modern issues, modern prejudices on our sources. The thing about the Templars is that militarily, they are the experts for the fighting march. They probably are the ones who taught Richard how to do the fighting march that goes from Acre down to Jaffa and gets interrupted at Arsuf. They're the ones who probably taught him about what the fighting march was. They do combined tactical arms warfare, and they are experts at the building and defense of castles, which is at the very heart of the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Castles are incredibly important.
Yeah,
and they garrison the castles. But we are running out of time, and I would like to talk a little about the non-military activities of the Templars. The thing that gets them later probably in trouble is the role they played in finance.
yes. No, you're absolutely right. And yeah, you're again spot on. The whole thing to do with money. I mean, there were an order where individuals were sworn to poverty, individual poverty. And we know from the evidence of the catalogue of their goods when they were rounded up at the end that by and large that was very true. These were people who took a major step down in life, when they came to join the order in a material sense. But there is the bigger issue is that they're kind of the elite warmongers in the East. they're the masters of the art of war in the
Yes.
East, but equally they're the masters of the arts of peace in the West. And again, it's a major irony, but it was very much in their interest for Europe to be incredibly peaceful. So you find there are teams of Templar diplomats, going around knocking heads together, talking, whispering in people's ears, saying, "For God's sake, don't attack so and so. The Holy Land needs your help." They knew that nobody could, a king couldn't go and help the Holy Land, or even give a significant amount of money, or let his people go if he was in the middle of a civil war, or he was fighting the French. If he was English, and vice versa. So they were, they have this bizarre dichotomy. And you mentioned it earlier. Really, there's a relatively small amount of young men on the front doing, kind of elite heroic things, but there's a much bigger pool of kind of older managerial types who are corporate lawyers, policy advisors, training specialists, agricultural. They're at the forefront of a lot of agricultural developments. They're great at logistics. They're leasing ships, but also fundamentally they're helping with finance, partly so that they can ingratiate themselves with the people who might go on crusade, particularly kings and queens, but also because they want to help fund crusading themselves. They lend money to volunteers who are going out there. They act as a very good way of transferring money through notes via Paris and so on, and that's hugely important. But as you quite rightly pointed out, being in a situation where you're handling a lot of money doesn't mean that it's your money personally, but handling a lot of money, the smell, you know what I mean? It rubs off. You get the smell of money attached to you, however unfairly. And the other big issue is lending money does make you slightly vulnerable. Then if you're in a small community, and there weren't many Templars, there weren't many Jews in Europe, there weren't many Northern Italian bankers. These are small groups, and you do find all of these small groups from time to time get into trouble because once you've borrowed money from somebody, well, emotionally, you come to resent them. But in a very practical sense, what's a quick way to write off debts? If you've got, your persecution and ghastliness. So I think they weren't doing much to personally enrich themselves. In fact, you can prove it. We have a stream of begging letters from the East saying to the guys in the West, saying, "Guys, come on, we're on the verge of bankruptcy. We can't pay the troops. The castle, there's been another earthquake. Half the castle's fallen down. We need cash." They were always on the verge of bankruptcy, so they weren't filthy rich, but they had this reputation for handling money, and they were vulnerable because they, with that, once you've got that reputation, if you're a small group, and in the case of the Templars, you're redundant because you've lost the Holy Land. You're suddenly you've made yourself a target. And the French monarchy, who attacked Jews, they attacked lepers, they attacked Northern Italian bankers. For them it was just part of the methodology. We're a bit short of cash this week. Let's take this lot down.
And essentially they do become sort of an international banking house because they have branches throughout Europe, and they have branches in the Holy Land. And if you're going from Europe to the Holy Land, these are the people that you want to entrust money to, withdraw money from. It makes a lot of sense to do this, and they can protect it. It's a function that the Templars have that we need to appreciate. And you're absolutely right. They are a force of peace in the West because nobody who wants crusades, whether it's a pope or it's the monastic orders, nobody who wants crusades wants violence in the West. And it's not just because of Christian pacifism, it's because, as you say, if you're having warfare with your neighbor, you can't afford to leave your lands unprotected to go save the Holy Land. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. No.
So what we have is this military order dedicated to the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, dedicated to protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land. But what happens if that Kingdom of Jerusalem disappears? The only fully successful crusade was the First Crusade. It established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived and even grew until 1187 and Saladin's victory at Hattin and his subsequent taking of Jerusalem. The Third Crusade reversed some of the losses, but the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 13th century, a Kingdom of Jerusalem without Jerusalem for most of the 13th century, is really the history of decline, of the loss of territories, gradually disappearing as
Yeah.
parts of it. I always thought of it as a story of a leper losing parts of his body. and, then, and by
Oh,
and by the
bless them.
middle of the
Yeah. No.
by the middle of the 13th century, Outremer, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is being reduced to a single city, Acre. And in 1291, Acre falls. And with it, Outremer ceases to exist. And the problem of being a Templar and having as your fundamental purpose for existence protecting pilgrims, protecting the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is disappearing along with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But I think that what we can do is we can go on to that in our next episode, and we can talk about what you brought up, how Philip the Fourth, Philip the Fair, and by fair what we mean is the good looking, not the just, how Philip the Fair of France decides that he is going to do something about the Templars, and that something is he's going to suppress it, and he's going to use their goods to launch his own crusade. And we'll come back to that in the next. So um, we'll be continuing this in a couple of weeks. And I just want to thank you for coming on because this is really neat stuff. I really enjoy talking about it, and I'm appalled that you like the Kingdom of Heaven because you.
I'm a
Because that's
simple girl. I'm easily pleased, obviously.
oh come on, that's Balian wasn't like that.
I know, but it's
And
not a lecture. If it was a lecture, I'd be more critical.
we'll return to this in the next episode because we'll be talking about how the Templars were turned into myth and how that myth has been represented in movies and even in video games.
Thank you,
And
Richard. Really enjoyed that.
that's it for this episode. I hope that you'll be able to join us for the second half of our series on the Templars. But until then, bye for now.